Hello, and welcome to Week 6, Unit 2 of Application Development for SAP Business by Design. In this unit, we're going to take an overview of life cycle. Now, we've obviously been developing lots of great content. We've been looking at different ways to create new objects, screens, enhance standard content, integrations, all kinds of stuff. But none of this does us any good until we can get it into the right tenant, and especially a productive tenant for the customer. So in that case, we have built-in lifecycle tools in the SAP Cloud Application Studio that will help us do that. And that's what we're going to focus on. It's just a high level about the different scenarios and ways that you can do it within the SAP Cloud Application Studio and SAP Business by Design. So I'm going to cover these different scenarios and talk about some things that you want to keep an eye out for, pitfalls. We'll have some guidelines at the end to bring to you to help you in your lifecycle management as well. So let's look at this. Sorry, let me start my slides again here. Here we go. So first off, let's look at from a pre-production tenant. So there is a case that a customer can go live, and at first they'll have their pre-production tenant. And we want to be able to develop on that tenant before they go live. Now we can only develop on a test tenant. We can never develop on a production tenant. That is not allowed, only to deploy solutions there. But in pre-production, it's a special case. And so what we can do is, as the customer, we're setting up the customer's pre-production tenant, we can go in, we can create a solution in our content, we can create our BOC element and deploy our content. We check in all the content, and we assemble and download it, and then activate it. And we don't have to deploy it anywhere. It's already in this tenant, and that following these steps is exactly what we need. And so then the customer can go live with this tenant, which then will become productive, and the solution's available there. If we want to enhance it later on, we can download it from that production tenant, upload it to a test tenant somewhere or a partner development tenant to then continue development. The next case, and a very typical case, is that you develop on a customer's test tenant. So every customer will have their production tenant and usually at least one test tenant. And then basically what you do is it's a very similar process. You go on the test tenant, basically what we've been doing in this class, and you would create your solution. You could, in there, create all your content. You would also have to, again, make sure you create this BOC element and check everything in. And then you can also then do the assemble and download step, and which will activate everything. It'll make sure that you have a BOC element, make sure that everything is checked in. It's a really nice thing is that if somebody's still working on a file, for example, it won't let you try and deploy that solution until they are done. Maybe they're trying to get a last minute change in. And so the SDK really tries to make sure that when you deploy, it's at a good point to deploy. And so we'll do the assemble and download of the solution. It'll do all this activation, and the assemble and download actually gives us a zip file that'll have a name. That's the technical name of our solution that starts with a Y and a long letter of strings and numbers, and that will then be our actual file that contains all the content of our solution, and that's what we'll use to actually go to the customer's production tenant, and we log in with the SAP Cloud Application Studio still, and we will upload that solution file into that tenant, and then we'd activate it there. So you see from the previous case, we didn't have to go through this extra step. From this point on, a customer's test and maintaining, we will always have to do this. So you would then upload it, you activate it, and after you upload it the first time into a tenant, you want to make sure that you go into the business configuration and that you actually scope in that solution, that you go to wherever the question is, and you scope the question in, and that way the solution is recognized in that tenant. After you do that the first time, you won't have to do that again. That's it. It's a one-time activity, but until you do that, that new content that you deployed will not be visible. Then the third case is that you have your own partner development tenant. And in this case, it's very similar to developing on a test tenant, yet you have to, very important step in the beginning is switch to the right customer. And so the administration menu at the top, there's a place to switch customers, and you would say that, okay, now I want to develop for this specific customer. You add your own customers in there based on their ID. which you'll get as part of your in the process of developing for them. And once you switch to the right customer, you'll be able to create your solution and continue on creating your content, your Bach element, checking all your files, assemble and download, and then you would upload to the tenant and their production tenant, activate it. You could also upload it to their test tenant first if you want and activate it there. You don't always have to go directly to production. And so then you can provide it in their test tenant and they can test it out there, and if they're happy then you can go ahead and upload it to production. You don't have to go ahead and assemble and download a different file for test or production. Once you have that solution file, that zip file, you can upload that to any of the customer's tenants you want, whether it's a test or a production tenant. And again, if it's the first time for that tenant, it has to be scoped in through the business configuration. And when you do your scoping in the business configuration, make sure you're not somehow using a studio user, a developer, an admin. You want to make sure you have a business user, somebody that does not have access to the SAP Cloud Application Studio. You should never do any business configuration changes in the Business Configuration Work Center with a studio user. I recommend that you don't even, you stay away from it as much as you can. Don't assign that to your user. You shouldn't need to. You can do all of the business configuration you need with the minimum authorizations as noted in one of our first units within the SAP Cloud Application Studio. So you should have some type of user that is not a studio user that goes in and does your business configuration scoping. So this is the typical process. You go, you assemble and download, and you deploy it. Now once you do that, your initial deployment of a solution, it's going to lock that solution out, and from that point on, to maintain it, you'll have to create what are called patch solutions. And a patch solution is just basically a copy of your original solution with a higher version number. It'll put it back into development, because after you assemble and download, your solution is actually locked. You won't be able to do any changes at that point in time. You can't change any text, you can't create any new content, you won't be able to delete your content in there. It's literally locked out for any changes. You create a new patch solution, and that opens up a new solution in what's called maintenance mode. And maintenance mode is basically some restrictions that are put in place by the SAP Cloud Application Studio for us as developers to make sure that we don't make changes that would be incompatible in another system, so we don't lose data, so we don't cause any kind of inconsistency. And so basically things like that it'll restrict us from deleting different content, from changing data types of elements. It's a list of different things that we can and can't do depending on what content it is. And we actually have units later on that will go into more detail about a patch solution and more about maintenance mode itself. But once we have the patch solution, we can go on to fix bugs, develop new content, maybe adapt some of the existing content. And we follow the same process. We'd assemble and download. We would go upload the new patch. We again would get a zip file. And we upload it back to whatever system it is, or we could even take that and deploy that to a new tenant as well. If we're on version 5 of our solution, we don't need to necessarily upload versions 1 through 4 in a new tenant. We can upload 5 directly and then be able to work off of that. If I did have 5 solution versions, I could upload version 3, for example, and then upload 5, but I won't be able to go back to 3. So it's important to note that as we go through this life cycle and deploy our solution, we can't deploy back a version. We can only deploy up. So if I deployed version 5 of my solution to production and I realize I actually don't like it, or it has a major bug I missed, I can't undeploy it and I can't roll back to version 4 or 3. I actually have to create a new patch, make that change, fix that bug, and then deploy this new version 6 into production. And that's going to be how I can move forward and continue with fixes. So it's a really important point I want to mention. You cannot roll back your changes by deploying a previous version that is not supported. You always have to create a new version, a new patch, make your changes there, and then deploy them. Also, when a solution is deployed, you won't be able to remove content on that system without removing the whole solution. So again, you'd have to. That's why you always have to also create another patch to make any changes if you need to delete content of some type. And remember, you're still within maintenance mode, the restrictions of this maintenance mode, so you can only delete or even hide things. And I'm going to talk a lot about that in a later unit. And so maintenance mode and patch solutions will allow us to continue to develop, but this is the life cycle that's there. So we basically will create a new solution or create a patch for an existing solution, change our content and deploy it, and you get these zip files. And the zip files, like I said, contain all the content of your solution. Since there's no history or change mandate of, let's say, a business object in the studio, the only place we saw that was in the UI designer. You can actually keep all your patch files and you can see the code within those. So that's kind of one way that you can have some kind of version history throughout the life cycle of your solution. Some guidelines at the end. One thing we recommend is that you keep to one solution per customer as best as you can. And really the reason we recommend this is because it goes into the fact, and we talked about this I think earlier, that any solution that we develop, only the content of that solution can only work within that solution. Like if I develop two solutions on one tenant, they can't talk to each other. I think we talked about this in the solution type unit, that solutions are separate from each other. They don't know that each other exists. So if I have my bonus plan in the solution that I've created, tomorrow I create a new solution, I can't directly reference bonus plan. It's not going to know what it is. I would have to use a web service between the two, which is not recommended. So if you keep everything in one solution, it kind of avoids this. And that doesn't mean that you always have to have one solution. You may have content that is never relevant to other content, and it doesn't need to be in the same solution. So maybe you have multiple solutions in that case, and that's perfectly fine. It's just that keep in mind, content in different solutions does not talk to each other. Another guideline, again, anything that you develop should always be within the same release. So especially when you upload. So for example, if I develop something in 1502 right now, SAP Business by Design 1502, I can't deploy it to 1411. And we talked a little bit about this at the beginning as well. So if one period where you might see this is during an upgrade period where your test tenant has been upgraded, production is not upgraded yet, maybe it'll be a week or two. You won't be able to take any 1502 content and upload it into your previous 1411 tenant. You have to wait till either that's upgraded itself. But you can also upgrade forward. So any content, 1502 content, I could put into a 1505 tenant if I want. And so that's one restriction to keep in mind as well. It's a much rarer case, but it's something that's there and you should be aware of. Also, there is quality criteria that is recommended in the help documentation that you should try and follow with all of your solutions. Let's go ahead and open that up right now. The help content, the quality criteria basically says, here are some things that you should keep in mind, that you should follow. If I go into the administration lifecycle management, I can see it here, quality criteria, things about response times, transactions, simple and complex, different texts, vulnerabilities, backdoors, all kinds of stuff to look for. The framework that's in place already factors a lot of stuff in, but of course any changes we make we have to be aware of and accountable for as developers, and these guidelines will help us stay within where we need to be. And there's also some other different info in here. As you go through it, I'll tell you on certain topics, here's something you might want to watch out for or keep in mind when you develop this. So go ahead and look through this. Take at least a simple look through it and get an idea of what's here, if not a very in-depth look at it and good understanding. And so that's kind of the highlight of lifecycle. Now through the next few units, we're going to actually go through and deploying our solution to another tenant. In this case, it's just going to be demo only. We don't have multiple tenants to deploy on here. You could always buddy up with somebody, and I'll talk a little bit about that on different ways. But for now, I'm just going to be demoing this, and I'll talk about these different things to look out for and different restrictions and pros and cons and things like that as we go through each of the different steps of life cycle. So that's the overview of the life cycle. In the next unit, we will actually work on deploying our original solution. Thank you very much.